Right. It would seem the cake of Bosasa's financial inducements and gratifications was larger than the one the facilities management company supplied for former President Jacob Zuma's 72nd birthday. The role of infamy of those who ate gluttonous slices from the pie of undue financial benefits from the late Gavin Watson's entity is rather long. It includes the ANC as a party, its top brass at the time, and leaders of government, from Zuma himself to his lieutenants, such as then ANC Secretary General and now Minister Gwede Mantashe, Zuma-era Minister Nomvula Mokonyane, Deputy Minister Thabang Makwetla, and disgraced former MP Vincent Smith, to count just a few, and believe me, this is just a few. But what the Zondo Commission report describes as the Bosasa modus operandi of corruption extended beyond political and executive leaders. It included within its scheme benefiting administrative leaders in entities like the Department of Correctional Services, including its former commissioner, Zach Modise. Let's unpack the third part of the report, and I'm joined now by James Brent Steyn, the investigative journalist and now spokesperson of the Western Cape local government, and Professor Mark Swilling, the sustainable development professor in the School of Public Leadership from the University of Stellenbosch, and of course Erin Bates, a legal writer from Business Day, who's been tracking these kinds of stories for a period of time. I don't know where to start. Professor Mark Swilling, you give it a go. I've been reading the story around Bosasa. It's one thing to know of the reporting that people such as Erin and James have been doing over a number of years, and what you have been flagging as well as activists, and hearing the testimonies at the Zondo Commission. It's quite another to see it being tied together in this report. What are the highlights for you?
Well, I think the highlight for me is the fact that the third report is devoted entirely to the Bosasa story. And what that effectively does is make it very, very clear that the state's capture story did not end when the Guptas got on a plane to Dubai. I think the second thing is that the Bosasa story is not limited to the Zuma era. It goes back to 2003. And the total quantity of contracts involved is around 12 billion. Compared to the Guptas, it's quite small. The Guptas are around 40 to 60 billion. I mean, Pravin Gordhan talked about state capture costing 250 billion. BBS was 2 billion. Steinhoff was 104 billion. So 12 billion is a lot, but it's not big compared to some of the others.
And Erin, let me bring you in here, and I think Professor Mark Swilling makes a good point there, that usually when these reports come out, there'll be part two, but it will have a number of volumes that focus on different things. With this one, it was part three, and no matter which volume you opened, it was Bosasa, Bosasa, Bosasa all the way, just the massive footprint of Bosasa. What are some of the key takeouts for you?
Yes, Thulas. Well, I think quite rightly both you and Professor Swilling highlighting that this third sort of wedge of the Commission's work is just on Bosasa. So 4 volumes, all of them pretty gripping reading, as you've suggested there. I do think the meat is really in the 4th volume from this tranche, and that is where you get the recommendations of the Commission. It includes the names of all the people you've mentioned, the likes of former President Jacob Zuma, Dudu Myeni, former chair of SAA, Nomvula Mokonyane, former Environmental Affairs Minister, and not only under former President Jacob Zuma, but also under current President Cyril Ramaphosa, now running organising for the governing party once more. And then, of course, Mineral Resources Minister Gwede Mantashe, amongst a slew of others, not only within the governing party and within government, but then also, of course, within the upper echelons of Bosasa. There we hear about the likes of Johannes Gumede, Papa Leshabane, Andries van Tonder, Angelo Agrizzi, Gavin Watson, the list goes on and on and on. And I think think, Thulas, just to your question kind of more acutely, the real thing you get out of this is what is state capture? And I think we talk largely about wide-scale corruption, fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, all of those kinds of crimes. But here what we see is mention specifically of how Bosasa, much like the Guptas, tried to change government policies and government strategies around things like how it was going to run the prisons department and how Bosasa was able to pull its levers of clout and influence there, make sure government moved in a certain direction, and then profit every step along the way.
Yeah, and James, let me bring you in. You wrote a book, of course, about the Bosasa billions. Did anything emerge from there that surprised you? And importantly, at what point do we start using the word racketeering? To say, when the Commission report talks about this was the modus operandi of corruption, and when I read it and I see that actually the target was not just decision makers and public elected officials and governing party officials, but it swung both ways, both the political leadership as well as the administrators who were going to be the implementers of policy. Are we at a point where we talk this was a racket?
Absolutely. I think that's without a doubt. What other way is it to explain state capture is just a new, nice, modern word for racketeering on a massive scale. With regards to the content in the book and the report, there's lots of similarities. I'd argue that this book that I did with my co-author, as well as several other books that have been done already, a lot of the material was out there. A lot of the material was thrashed out at the Zondo Commission very publicly. And as the professor noted quite correctly, it was for me what was the interesting start of this whole thing was in January 2019. After 6 months of hearing about, or whatever, 5 months of hearing about the Guptas, everyone thought the Zondo Commission was about the Gupta investigation, and the state capture was limited to this family and its influence. This secret witness appeared larger than life, Mr. Angelo Agrici, and he testified for a very long time. And he just took this whole racketeering story into a whole new direction. And he actually raised, for me, the concern is, the professor mentioned that the Guptas was significant, I think what it said, a few $100 billion is the estimated impact. Bosasa about 12 billion. But what the Bosasa thing shows is that this web of racketeering and state capture extended far beyond the Guptas. Certainly the Bosasa case was one element, and I suppose my main concern coming out of all of this is where else does this web continue to go? And I am quite curious whether the Zondo Commission managed to get to every little piece of the racketeering mess that certainly I believe the ruling party has a lot to answer for.
Erin, let's go a step further in this conversation. Whenever reports like these come out, you immediately have the reaction of those who are implicated, who will instantly say R1 billion later, and there was nothing they could find on me, and basically they are asking for further investigations. But I don't know about you, but one of the things that struck me was how Angelo Agrici's evidence, as much as he's criticized in many respects, that he sort of sought to minimize his own role in wrongdoing and in corruption, but overall, his version of events is corroborated, isn't it?
In some ways, very much so, and the very report of the Commission, or one of the volumes, deals with that. It deals with where Agrici tried to underplay his culpability for racketeering, for corruption, for paying heaps of cash bribes to people on the Bosasa payroll or its unofficial payroll, and yet he is such an important witness to the Commission and its work. And I think just to sort of bounce off what Brent Steyn was saying there about the ANC, you really get a sense here of just what it means to capture the governing party. And if you want to have your bread buttered, so to speak, as a service provider to government, Bosasa clearly knew that you needed to get very cozy with people high up in the governing party. high up right to the very top. There's no doubt that around about page 800 of this section of the Commission's report, you hear that they went all the way to the office of the President of the ANC, then former President Jacob Zuma, well then now, and we hear about visits from Gavin Watson down to Nkandla, discussions about who should be leading up the NPA, quashing investigations by the Special Investigating Unit into Bosasa. It's not news here that Bosasa was up to mischief with the ANC and with government. And all this is stuff we somewhat knew about. We really didn't know the extent of it without hearing from Angelo Agrizzi and all the people who followed after him.
Professor Swilling, a lot of it doesn't make sense to me, I must tell you, in that some of the things that our so-called leaders were willing to sell off their souls for, come on, these guys surely could have afforded someone like Thabang Makwetla could have afforded to install his own security. Nomvula Mokonyane could have afforded to do his own security, and so could Gwede Mantashe. Things like the Christmas packages that have now been found that on a balance of probabilities that may have been supplied to Nomvula Mokonyane. Does it make sense to you, some of what they were willing to sell their souls for?
Well, I mean, it doesn't make sense, from a moral perspective, but it does make sense in terms of the way in which our body politic has evolved since 1994. I mean, what we really need to understand is state capture is a systemic process. Although it's lawyers that have kind of written the report, and lawyers focus on individuals and their culpability or not, what that could miss is the fact that what we're dealing with here is a very systemic process of breakdown, of institutional hollowing out, of a society that becomes immune. And eventually, what's the greatest culprit of all is the loss of hope and the loss of the South African story. So it's in that context that we need to understand these reports. But in the book that we recently published called The Anatomy of State Capture, we talked about different kinds of rackets. And we defined rackets as the process of enrolling people in a believable lie. And it's quite important to understand that. So in the context of a black elite that didn't have large assets in order to drive accumulation and therefore had to depend on the state, it became relatively easy to justify certain kinds of actions on the grounds of positive things like black economic empowerment. Do this because it is time to transform the economy. And there were justifications, believable lies, that were able to, in a sense, trump people's own personal moral qualms that they may have had. And the SACC had the unburdening panel, where they created an opportunity for Christians to come forward and unburden themselves. And although no one's ever seen those stories, one can imagine what they say.
James, you said one of the things that concerns you is how many more of these rackets continue to run, or attempts to run them at least do continue. I would say the other concern for me is perhaps a lack of appreciation of some of these concepts around conflict of interest, for example. The arguments that were being advanced by some of these politicians when confronted to say, did you not see the conflict of interest? And people like Thabang Makwetla, for example, saying that they didn't see a conflict of interest in discussing the rates that would be charged in terms of an extended contract by one of the contractors doing business with the department over which I was deputy minister, and I just didn't see the conflict of interest. I would say that's one of the things that worries me, but also the reaction that has come through from people such as Minister Gwede Mantashe, for example, that says, look, technically they've not found anything against me. They are saying it's possible that a further investigation could find something, not seeing the problematic nature of the beneficiation. What do you think of my proposal?
what can I tell you? So there's a lot of things you asked in there, and the first would be this. We speak, how far does this web go? How many other areas of government is involved that we haven't even looked into? I mean, the journalists in this country, they do a magnificent job under very dire, difficult circumstances with limited resources. And even them, I think, are scratching this, just scratching the surface of what we are dealing with. So if you're getting 50,000 Rand cash from Bosasa a month to you and me, it doesn't sound like a lot, but you might be getting 50,000 from another 10 other companies. I mean, we don't know for sure. On Minister Mantashe and some others, it's the eNCA argument for me. You go to your house, Mantashe, I think, have three houses. Security installations, what was it, in excess of 300,000 Rand per house installed. How do you not see that? It's like going to eNCA and you see a swimming pool and you say, this just appeared magically overnight. How do you not see that? And then, at the very least, morally, not saying, well, he's arguing, the argument is, I didn't ask for this, it just appeared magically. Well, then, the one question I would ask is, did you offer then to pay for it? Did you pay tax for it? Fringe benefit tax? Did SARS even step in? And that's my other concern, is the complete lack of accountability by any part of the accounting authorities, the MPA, the SIU, SARS in this instance. I mean, if I receive benefits in excess of about R1 million, SARS is going to smash me, to pieces. They're going to come and collect. I haven't seen them collect a dime from the minister in question. I haven't even seen them collect anything from former President Jacob Zuma. I mean, are these people above the law? Are they treated differently by institutions like SARS? I'd very much dare your picture. On your picture, you can see some of the insecurity stuff. I mean, it's very obviously the stuff was there, so you can't deny it. So what have they done to square that debt? And just going to Mr. Agrizi, by the way, I think he did a magnificent job as a whistleblower. But I've told him this personally. You've done a good job. But what have you done to give back the proceeds of crime? I mean, we're speaking about the proceeds of crime here. And his claim has been he did a good job, and he was the operations officer, and the meals were delivered to the jails. But still, you've benefited from the proceeds of crime, and one has to ask, what do people do to square that account?
Lastly, let me ask this question to each one of you, the same question. Erin, starting with you. So what? This third part of the Zondo Commission report is out. It's voluminous. My eyes are sore from just trying to wade through it as much as possible. That, for me, poses the risk that it can get lost in the ether. And the result is that accountability, the demand at least for accountability, is likely to be slightly diminished in that it won't be popular reading.
It won't be, and I do think the Commission and the Presidency have really lost an opportunity here to be more decisive and strategic about how they relay the findings or the recommendations of the Commission's work. We're also seeing the fatigue set in because this whole process has taken much longer than it should have. It's cost in excess of easily R1 billion, and we're going to see at least one or if not two more reports. But having said that, I think that anybody who does some of the even skim reading that it takes to get a sense of what's been found out here by Zondo and his team will find out that firstly there's an egregious scale of thievery going on. It involves the most senior members of our governing party, former and current, and that they are happy to treat us like idiots because we get tired of hearing the same story over and over again with a few details tweaked. So just to remind everybody, and perhaps myself here, that there was blatant thieving going on right under our noses involving the very heads of the governing party, people high up in government itself and in private business. And we know who they are because of the report. So it's really up to the prosecuting authority, with pressure from the public and civil society, to make sure that something gets done.
Erin, we can take comfort in knowing that people such as Professor Mark Swilling will ensure that this is not lost in the ether. This surely, Professor Swilling, should form part of what you instill and you teach going forward for posterity at least, so that it's recorded, so that it doesn't become like, you know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations that, you know, were never followed through, and there's even confusion sometimes as to what exactly did the Truth and Reconciliation Commission do and what did it recommend. Yeah. So it's a challenge to you, is it not, to all of us, to keep it alive?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, that's why we brought out this new book on the anatomy of state capture, and a significant number of chapters are devoted to the private sector and its involvement in state capture. And I think that's the significance of the Bosasa case. It's a South African company set up by South Africans, deeply rooted in the long political body politic of the liberation movement before 94 and after. And the way in which a private company like that sinks its teeth into the political system in the way that it did is a very dramatic story, and needs to be taken up by organized business, the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants, and so on and so forth. So that's really the long-term story. Are we going to be able to clean up South African capitalism, or is it inherently corrupt?
All right, James, final word to you. So what? You know, it's huge, it's massive. I will read it because I want to have a conversation, an intelligible conversation with you guys, and sort of to understand for the work that I do. But how do we ensure that it's not lost in the ether, and that it enrages, I think it should enrage South Africans into really demanding more from their president, their current president, but also from other former leaders, former President Jacob Zuma and others, to ensure that there's actually accountability, as well as those tasked with the wheels of justice in this country?
It's a mouthful. It's a Saturday, right? So I can say what I want. No, I'm kidding. Look, for me, I suppose the only hope that I have is that that people, the general public, people out there, that the sentiment of the ANC is this great magnanimous savior and person who has the people on the ground's best interests at heart, that has been crushed and destroyed by the stuff coming out from Zondo. The fact that this was a company set up by some very senior ANC heavyweights, including Nomvula Mokonyane, including several others. It's an illustrious name list. And the stuff they got involved in, and in an arena that really targeted some of the most desperate people in our society. I feel personally, you know, in a sense, it sounds quite strange, I suppose, but in a sense, quite sorry for prisoners in our country who've been punished, and they're sitting in our jails, which are amongst the worst in the world. And this company and these political elites were drinking Johnny Walker Blue Label while these prisoners are being, you know, pretty much getting the worst end of a raw deal that you can possibly get. So for me, I'd imagine that hopefully politically there would come a change one day, and that one would see proper accountability follow that. You know, the TRC, we've just seen the Neil Agate story. So the wheels of justice sometimes takes a long time to grind, but it grinds finally. And it might still catch up with some of these people whose names have come up, and let's see what happens.
All right, James, I've got to thank you. James Brent Steyn, investigative journalist. Of course, he's moved on to become the spokesperson for the Western Cape Department of Local Government. Professor Mark Swilling from the University of Stellenbosch, as well as Erin Bates, legal writer for Business Day. As you heard there, in conclusion from me, it was in August 2020 that President Cyril Ramaphosa told us that in as far as corruption is concerned, the ANC stands in the dock and stands as accused number one. This latest volume just adds to the evidence against accused number one. What will accused number one do to sort of redeem themselves of the ghosts of corruption? We'll see.